1981 Identity Crisis. High atop a crenellated turret flanked by castle walls, there perched a wizard named Morley. He surveyed the teeming crowds below. It was part of what Strategy and Tactics would call an elaborate B-grade movie set, with a gateway guarded by a bloodshot-eyed dragon, obviously a frequent guest at the TSR office parties. The scene was the Hobby Industry of America trade show. At the end of 1981, and TSR's medieval booth won an award for Will Niebling's animatronic showpiece. This was not TSR's first promotional stop of the year. Niebling and Gygax had manned the Mattel booth at the Consumer Electronics Show in Vegas to demonstrate the new electronic version of the game to distributors and retailers who hungrily anticipated its Christmas release. All would be on display shortly thereafter. At the February Toy Fair in New York, a part of now ceaseless, expensive promotional roadshow, TSR had become a very different thing than it was just 2 years before. At the beginning of 1981, no ceiling for sales of Dungeons & Dragons was in sight. The game was like a magic item that relentlessly generated gold. TSR's showy booths could now promote the repackaged Dungeon board game by Dave McGarry, flanked by the basic and expert set boxes, which were overdue the previous October and just barely made it in time for the trade shows. It must have been of no small interest to Arneson's legal team that while the new version of the basic set booklet still listed Gygax and Arneson as authors, crediting Tom Moldvay as an editor, the expert set gave Zeb Cook and Steve Marsh as editors, but mentions neither Gygax nor Arneson, nor what exactly that booklet was editing. With every uptick in sales, the stakes in the Arneson lawsuit grew commensurately higher. The legal teams representing Arneson and TSR prepared for battle. John Freeman was deposed in San Francisco on January 15th, and the case was slated to go to trial by April. The future of D&D was too bright to live in the shadow of a lawsuit. TSR simply had to settle with Arneson. The agreement signed on March 6 forged a treaty in Arneson's Great War. As Arneson's press release at the time put it, the terms in the settlement ensure authorship credits on the D&D game for Arneson, as well as clarifying his rights to future D&D royalties. Arneson also received a financial settlement for his stock in TSR Hobbies Incorporated. While that press release represents the situation as a decisive victory, settlements tend to leave all aggrieved parties equally miserable. The terms were far more modest than Arneson's initial demands of TSR. In lieu of the six-figure cash damages requested in his complaint, TSR instead simply bought back the 56 shares Arneson owned, giving their $1,000 valuation at the time. That did mean a significant windfall, but it also rid TSR of Arneson's unwelcome presence at shareholder meetings. In practice, the settlement more or less ignored the authorship credits Arneson had sought. As Gary Gygax's name would continue to appear alone on all of the core advanced D&D books for the rest of the decade, and Arneson's name would not grace the box cover of future revisions of the basic set. Finally, Arneson's royalties on the AD&D game would not be 5%, but instead 2.5%, the same amount that Gygax received. While the agreement guaranteed for those royalties a minimum payment of $150,000 annually through 1984, the total royalties Arneson could gain from those titles was capped at $1.2 million. The likelihood that this agreement would make Arneson a millionaire surely made him overlook any concessions in his desired terms, but this last provision also virtually justified the entire settlement from TSR's perspective. As optimistically as they viewed their future sales prospects for his other D&D titles, Arneson would receive a further guaranteed minimum of $20,000 per year for the duration of the copyrights. Different worlds gossiped admiringly about Arneson's settlement. I bet that if you put 5 zeros after a number, you would be in the right order of dollar magnitude. That kind of money could capitalize quite a game company. Many apparently believed a court had decided in his favor, and the perception of a vindicating legal judgment cemented the growing consensus in the hobby that Arneson contributed the greater part of the invention of D&D. But Arneson himself, as part of the process of crafting the legal case, had recently been immersed in correspondence from 1972 and 1973. Now that his fortune was amassed, he would deliver a more candid account of his own role in writing the game's text. On April 21st, Arneson gave an interview to Pegasus magazine where he reported on the aftermath of demonstrating the Blackmoor Camp dungeon to Gygax and the Lake Geneva group. At the time, they had a lot more spare time than I did. They had a lot of ideas, so they came up with their own version of the rules. They sent theirs to us, and we fooled around with them for a while. We exchanged letters for a while and just kind of slipped into it. Arneson also used that April Pegasus interview to announce the future roadmap for Adventure Games, his lavishly financed successor to Adventures Unlimited. His immediate plans for the company included releasing a modern naval miniature board game called Harpoon, designed by Larry Bond, but he promised to follow that quickly with several titles long in the works. Richard Snyder's Mutant would be out for the conventions this summer. He also proposed to return to John Snyder's Star Probe and Star Empires, which Arneson said will be presented in a series of about 6 booklets, which will be released one at a time. Rounding out this Twin Cities coalition, he alluded to a new game design by Dave McGarry called Pentantis Star. In reference to his own design work, he remained committed to the Samurai project for the Chaosium, observing that 2 other people have beaten me to being published, but time will tell which is best. Arneson spoke with the greatest animation about continuing on with Adventures in Fantasy. Now that Adventure Games owned the title, he could cut the price and give it the marketing it deserved. But the independent review of Adventures in Fantasy that followed Arneson's interview in Pegasus was no more complimentary than the notices from the year before, even taking into account the reduced price point. Arneson made much of how he could remedy price and production issues with the second edition, which he identified as another project in the works at Adventure Games. For the time being, he slapped an Adventure Games sticker on Excalibur boxes to obscure the former owner's logo. The period around the settlement was not so triumphant at TSR. It was a tense and quiet time. Random events went on an unannounced hiatus from February through April. Upon its resumption, reporting that the Dragon publication staff were no longer able to produce the magazine itself. Gygax was also conspicuously absent from the pages of Dragon. His contributions had petered out a bit after Gen Con the previous year, and his byline would effectively be absent until November 1981. When his regular column, The Sorcerer's Scroll, returned with an admission that not much magical ink has flowed from cockatrice quill to parchment for this column for a year now. It was February when Gygax, perhaps taking Frank Mentzner's advice about the very real dangers of the spotlight, brought on staff Jim Johnson as administrative aide to the president. Johnson served as Gygax's chauffeur and bodyguard. Following the settlement, Gygax reported another bout of debilitating illness. In a letter to Steve Marsh, Gygax went into detail. It is the same thing that struck me right after GenCon last year. This time it was more severe. Going back to April, he described a variety of ailments from an intestinal complaint to a pinched nerve in his lower back. As a consequence, he was not up to working full-time at the office yet. Even at the end of the month, he predicted, I probably will not get back into full swing at the office for another month or so yet, for I do not care to risk another, possibly more serious bout of illness again. As of late mid-May, the resumed random events noted that Gary has been housebound of late this last week. It was surely detailed during this lull following the settlement that Gygax wrote a singular essay called Who Am I? It was a curiosity for any number of reasons, an almost confessional piece exploring what he wanted out of life. Like his many earlier retrospectives, it reviewed the founding of TSR and his tireless struggle to elevate it to its current situation. Though surely Gygax saw those events through the filter of the settlement, he began with his childhood, following by the wargaming clubs and the first GenCon, continuing through the founding of the original Tactical Study Rules Partnership as something of a hobby, and the shocking death of Don Kay. After that, he wrote, in 1976 came an identity crisis. Was I a game player, or was I a writer and designer? The modest initial success of D&D required that Gygax attend to so many TSR matters that actually playing games fell by the wayside. At first, Gygax found that designing games was more fun than playing them. When the time came, as the business expanded and began to engage design staff, he thought perhaps he could enter more of an advisory position in which he could further indulge his passion for playing. But then in 1980, with the company pulling in over $8 million in sales, Gygax once again faced an identity crisis. The demands of the cooperation preclude being its chief executive officer and a designer writer at the same time. Was I an executive, or did I wish to return to the creative end? Ultimately, Gygax resolved this dilemma by deciding to remain an executive. He felt a clear responsibility to his staff, now numbering more than 100 people, to contribute in the capacity that was best for the company. I hope I do not regret it in the time ahead, Gygax mused to himself, his inner conflict about renouncing game design on full display. This expanded on the sentiments Gygax expressed to Steve Marsh at the end of 1980, where he had admitted, I would love to give up business for writing, but I cannot in good conscience do so, at least the next couple of years. By the end of the essay, Gygax seems to have convinced himself that he made the right decision. He approached business like an adventurer, exclaiming business is a fun game too. He encouraged others to follow careers in adventure gaming, which at worst would provide a paycheck, but advised that if you approach the industry with gaming in mind, you will be ahead. He believed that logic and reasoning, planning and negotiation, learning and dedication, which come from game playing, can be of immeasurable help in business. His own example proved the point. A high school dropout and game expert had risen into the national spotlight, to the very cusp of being a household name. Perhaps the greatest curiosity of all is the piece appeared in the July issue of a competitor's magazine, Space Gamer. Why publish it there rather than in Dragon? Perhaps Gygax wanted to share these thoughts but also bury them a bit, safely out of the baleful gaze of Dragon, which had a circulation now nearing 50,000, up from just 15,000 the year before, and Space Gamer managed barely a tenth of that. In its rapid growth spurt, Dragon surpassed the stagnant circulation of strategy and tactics, as that magazine conceded in its March 1981 issue to become the dominant publication in hobby gaming, and it was still growing. People internally had begun to estimate when it might pass the 100,000 mark. One name Gygax never mentioned in Who Am I is Dave Arneson. That was consistent with TSR's corporate communications in the wake of the settlement. The May issue of Toy and Hobby World, a major retailer trade magazine, led with a corporate profile of TSR that focused almost exclusively on Gygax and his creative impetus. We learned from reading it that in 1972 he took the big step and put aside his regular job to enter the speculative field of full-time game design. In keeping with the heroic inventor character he had adopted, the profile related how creature comforts were few indeed for his family, as Gary designed unsold games and sustained his household as a part-time cobbler. The ink on TSR's settlement with TSR had barely dried, but there was no mention that D&D might have had a co-creator in the piece. It instead described how Gygax began to apply his imagination to the creation of game systems that combined the best features of fantasy and gaming. He then introduced a new element to gaming, the play of a game character, a personal touch that proved to be the key element in the birth of role-playing games. Similarly, in the Jew issue of Playthings, Gygax talked about the invention of games in terms like, when I wrote the Dungeons & Dragons role-playing game, I wrote it for myself and for my friends. Who had been playing board games and board games for years, with no mention that anyone else might have been involved. The resolution of the legal situation thus would not end the rivalry between Gygax and Arneson. When TSR began promoting its new Role-Playing Gamers Association, it promised to offer a subscription service that kept players attached to the AD&D brand, something like the original model of the Judges Guild. Incidentally, the 2-year license that the Judges Guild had signed with TSR to make AD&D products was due to expire imminently. Once the RPGA had been announced in the February Dragon, Arneson saw it as a blatant attempt to organize the community around the single pole of TSR. So he began working toward a competing organization, the International Fantasy Gaming Society, which took its name from the recent science fiction novel Dream Park by Larry Niven. To initially populate his IFGS, not to rally around any single set of rules which would repeat the fallacy exemplified by another so-called great designer who tried to be a god. Instead, Arneson stressed the position that rules were inessential to the game, that all great innovators in role-playing had started without rules. This idea was not met with much enthusiasm from the likes of Saint Andre or Perrin, who published rules and struggled to advance them in the marketplace. Still stung by his experience at Origins in 1978, Arneson stressed that the group should establish an award for the best role playing game of the year, but on the strict condition that this award would be given to authors and designers, not to companies. Arneson's great war against Gygax and TSR had given way to a tenuous peace, a cold war perhaps, but the battle for control of D&D and the industry it created would continue unabated. TSR was beginning to have an identity crisis of its own. By May, staff had increased to 110, driven by an influx of young staffers bouncing off or sometimes through the walls of the deteriorating Hotel Claire. Many were college-age artists or designers. Some were still teenagers. Gygax personally would not drive the creative process of the company. He had apparently knocked off quite a few new monsters for a planned sequel to the Monster Manual prior to his bouts of illness, as well as some work towards his long-promised Temple of Elemental Evil, but these were not forthcoming anytime soon. TSR was now dependent on a stream of modules and games developed by its boisterous design staff. Hijinks inevitably ensued. The third floor of the Hotel Claire had a false ceiling, as it had originally been a cavernous ballroom, so there was the time when Errol Otis tried to crawl his way to the space above Zeb Cook's office with the aim of making spooky noises. The ceiling was so thin that Otis prematurely fell through right above the desk of Tom Oldvay, who was naturally startled to find half a person suddenly dangling and flailing above him. Once, when a manager was late to unlock the doors at the Hotel Claire, Steve Winters simply scaled the fire escape, entered through one of the rickety windows at the art department, and then let everyone in. Or there was the time when Skip Williams saw a few unfamiliar people loading goods from the basement of the Hotel Claire to a car early in the morning. It did not strike him as an unusual situation at first, and only striking up a conversation with them did he realize that they were, in fact, burglars. With Gygax scarce around the office, it would be Kevin Bloom wielding the title of Chief Operating Officer who would steer the company to adopt a more professional identity through the imposition of unfamiliar discipline. Harkening back to the 1976 Employee Handbook, staffers who failed to use the time clock properly would be given demerit points for a major offense. Bloom's primary concession to softening the tone of his internal communication was by festooning his memos with clip art from the Peanuts comic strip. Under his direction, significant staff turnover began to change the face of TSR. In the art department, Dave Sutherland was promoted to vice president of graphics and design, with Jim Rosloff under him to manage the art team directly. TSR now had a mandate to recruit a staff capable of producing the caliber of art that adorned fantasy paperback covers, which would lead them to seek out talent like Larry Elmore. What followed was a changing of the guard. The prolific artist Otis departed in 1981 with a scholarship from TSR to help support his continuing education at Berkeley. Others, however, would leave under less amicable circumstances. TSR's new policies soon alienated many of the founding members of its design department. Since 1978, TSR had offered staff an effective royalty on products developed in-house, most recently through Creative Bonuses program. By 1981, Lawrence Schick, whose understaffed design team had perennial difficulties making deadlines the year before, had stepped back from his vice presidency to refocus his efforts on the Alien Worlds project he spearheaded along with Zeb Cook. As early as February, the game's official title Star Frontiers had begun to leak, but when a decision was made to end the Creative Bonuses program, the work that Schick had put into the Star Frontiers project now looked like it would yield no royalties. Furious, Schick resigned, and there was talk of legal action. Work on Star Frontiers would continue as a staff project, but it would now be late entering the marketplace that SPI planned to assault with its forthcoming game, Universe. Morale among the design staff declined across the board, and this led to more departures. Staffers from the West Coast who were seen as unruly, like Paul Reich and Evan Robinson, were let go. A post termination resignation letter of the "You Can't Fire Me 'Cause I Quit" variety, hastily written by Kevin Hendricks that summer, gives an understandably bitter take on the matter. TSR claims that it cares about and values its employees, and that it wants all employees to be happy in their jobs, yet any who become unhappy are considered to have a bad attitude, a currently very popular euphemism, and rather than investigate the causes of employee discontent, TSR prefers to take the simplistic view that such persons are malcontents and that mass terminations are the best solution. It also calls out rampant nepotism and cronyism, a growing concern among employees as the ranks of Gygax and Bloom family members in the company swelled. When Random Events resumed in May, the very first article it ran addressed the recent personnel changes and insisted there is no purge or any implied threat to our employee population. As among the many people let go, there was no common reason in any of the situations. Each was an event unique to the individuals and work arrangements involved. But disgruntled exiles made sure the message spread far and wide. Rumor says that TSR has fired a dozen or so employees for bad attitude. As Different Worlds reported, wondering, does this presage a corporate shift of emphasis? But as quickly as TSR issued pink slips, they brought in replacements. The cover of the June random event alone lists 17 new hires. Within that issue, those new staffers could read a limerick. There was a young fellow named Gary. His face was decidedly hairy. His passion for games and weird thought-up names provided the jobs and were merry. Whatever motivated the reductions in staff, it was not want of cash. In order to report results at a time of year closer to when rivals like Avalon Hill and SPI did, TSR planned to close its 1981 fiscal year at the end of the second quarter in June, rather than the end of the third quarter in September, as it had since its founding. As such, the fiscal year 1981 earnings for TSR stood at around 9.7 million, which might seem like only a marginal increase over the previous year's take of 8.3 million, but that is because it only counted 3 quarters of sales, and what would have been their fourth quarter was a dramatic one, grossing $6 million. For this reason, most of the bar graphs used to chart the company's growth over the years mark a $16 million total for 1981. TSR Hobbies had sold 750,000 copies of the basic set over the 12 months leading up to June at $12 each, which would become their most widely repeated media brag. With that kind of income, the obligations of the settlement with Arneson proved eminently manageable. TSR Hobbies booked an operating charge for 1981 of $600,000, reflecting the minimum royalty payments it would owe to Arneson over the next 4 years. While this figure would have bankrupted the company in 1979, now TSR could absorb it easily. Even factoring it in, TSR made over $1 million of profit in 1981, slightly above the year before. As for how the revenue tally situated TSR in the adventure game industry at the time, we can go back to Howard Barash's annual scoreboard in strategy and tactics, ignoring their abbreviated 9-month fiscal calendar. He gave TSR's 1981 figure as $17 million out of a total industry income of $31 million. TSR's take thus exceeded that of all other adventure game businesses combined. Around half of all consumer spending on adventure games was on role-playing titles, which led to a 78% boost over the year before. Barash paid Avalon's Hill's income from adventure gaming at $5.2 million and SPI's at $2.1 million. A handful of companies came in at or over $1 million, including Games Designers Workshop and Yakinto. The Judges Guild's take, with its agreement with TSR still in place, was measured at $770,000. Barash had the revenue of prominent firms like the Chaosium and Steve Jackson Games, under $200,000 each. Companies like Flying Buffalo and Adventure Games were not individually listed, but instead grouped into an other category that Barash valued at less than $500,000 total. TSR thus wielded a clout in the industry unknown since Avalon Hill's heyday in the early 1970s. The initial appetite for adventure games came to the hobby from a fresh demographic in 1981. A full 60% of TSR products would be purchased by or for consumers aged 10 to 14. That youthening of the player base had implications for how the public weighed the potential impact of the game. Discover magazine had covered the Dungeons & Dragons craze in their January issue with a balance of perspectives, but when it came to Egbert, it suggested that his disappearance was never fully explained, but that many people thought his death was related to the reality-bending quality of the game. It also referenced the Haber City incident the year before, which is described as one where parents exorcised Dungeons and Dragons from the after-school program amid charges that it was anti-religious, too heavy with symbols of witchcraft and demonology. Throughout the year, the success of D&D attracted increasing scrutiny from evangelical pundits. Christian Life Ministries, an independent church in Sacramento, California, began circulating crude tracts pointing to direct violations of God's holy word in D&D that would furnish several reasons why Christians cannot play this game. Many of these arguments come across as nitpicking. For instance, because some promotional text in Player's Handbook calls the game mind unleashing, it must be forbidden, as Christians are to be constantly in control of their thoughts, or because the rulebooks state that in the fantasy of the game, even the gods themselves may enter your character's life, and the very plural gods implies pantheism. It violates a biblical commandment regardless of whether anyone believed those gods were real. Christian Life Ministries reached most of its following through a radio show featuring the evangelist John Turrell. Turrell was the sort who crusaded against the celebration of Halloween and believed Sacramento to be home to over 1,000 witches. D&D became a focus of his broadcasts, and one listener, a church directory salesman, was alarmed to find that Rancho Cordova Park and Recreation on the east side of Sacramento had scheduled 2 D&D sessions at its facilities for the summer of 1981. Apparently 20 students had signed up to participate, so a challenge was brought before the Park and Recreation Board demanding the D&D sessions be canceled. Turrell's argument was that D&D is a religion in the guise of a game, and therefore scheduling the game violated the separation of church and state under the Constitution. The district would be encouraging a particular religion in the 20 students who signed up for the game sessions. The board was told matter of factly this game teaches witchcraft and demon worship, and that leads to Satan worship. I mean, if you're worship, why wouldn't you, anyways? In the court of public opinion, even D&D itself faced something of a crisis over its identity and nature. Was it just a game or introduction to dark magic? On June 17th, the Cordova Park and Recreation District Board voted in a 3-2 split to cancel the classes after 90 minutes of spirited debate. The teacher was scheduled to lead the sessions could only remark, "I can't believe the board did what it did. It's unreal." One of the dissenting board members went on record to say, "I feel we've censored something we don't have the authority to censor." But it would be misleading to represent that the vote hinged entirely on religious censorship. A board member who supported the cancellation justified it by explaining, "If a program is controversial, we shouldn't hold it in a public facility. Parks and recreation boards can be forgiven for being unwilling to take provocative stances," but another member who voted for the ban argued that since the Supreme Court has already barred religious activity for public facilities, they were compelled to cancel the classes, as Dungeons and Dragons is clearly religious in content. The same board member expressed no objection to playing the game in private, saying he would even defend that right. This was exactly the argument fundamentalists had hoped would prevail, and buoyed by its success, the same line of argument came to the Folsom Cordova School Board. However, it would be rejected. Ultimately, the Rancho Cordova decision became yet another soundbite of controversy that would be spliced with the steam tunnel incident. And the Heber City decision by the media. Canceling a planned activity subsidized by public funds is not equivalent to setting a policy prohibiting that activity in a community, but this nuance would rarely be acknowledged. In its reporting about the Rancho Cordova controversy, the Los Angeles Times blithely asserted that school officials in Heber City, Utah have banned the game, which simply was not true. The understandable reluctance of Parks and Recreation board members to court controversy would similarly lose all nuance in subsequent reporting and become another community imposing a ban. The summer convention season in 1981 was a game of musical chairs, as GenCon and Origins fought a proxy battle over smaller regional conventions. Origins fought would take place in the Bay Area thanks to the winning bid by the team that had run GenCon West for TSR back in 1976 and 77. So there would be Pacific Origins, but that left the East Coast potentially without a summer event. Two plans thus developed simultaneously. Avalon Hill aspired to run an Atlanticon in Baltimore, but independently, the team that had run Origins in 1979 and 1980 worked toward an EastCon in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. TSR threw its full weight behind the latter plan, which was soon rebranded GenCon East. The two events were scheduled for the same weekend, just a couple hours apart by car, and an outmaneuvered Avalon Hill ultimately scrapped its plans, moving its slate of Atlanticon events to the GenCon East schedule. Although, in years past, the Avalon Hill General happily boasted about attendance figures for Origins, they were not eager to share numbers for Pacific Origins, which were surely well less than 4,000, possibly even 1,000 less. Avalon Hill's coverage was very critical of the Pacificon team, both for lacking organization and for an emphasis on fantasy and role-playing over wargaming. Indeed, as Tom Shaw of Avalon Hill would later fume in a letter to campaign, Pacific Origins rejected our offer to promote Origins in the manner in which we have supported all past Origins conventions. This was not lost on the attendees, one who remarked that the organizers stressed D&D and FRP far too much for the type of con Origins should be. The Bay Area was the home turf of the Chaosium, and the convention featured a heavy presence of West Coast fantasy luminaries, as well as a strong showing from the medieval reenactors in the Society for Creative Anachronism. But not much of the board Awards. The year before, Howard Barash estimated as its voting body an Academy of Adventure Gaming Arts and Design made up of creative professionals and contributing hobbyists in the industry who would pay a modest $2 per year for membership. Around 200 Academy members were eligible to vote in the 1981 awards under the supervision of a 25-member awards committee who could vet nominations and categories to make the accolades defensible. The unintended consequence of this process was that Gary Gygax was voted into the Adventure Gaming Hall of Fame, the highest honor among the awards, previously reserved for the likes of Tom Shaw and Jim Dunningham. Arneson could not have been happy to see Gygax collect any further laurels, but his own plan to launch an international fantasy gaming society as a competitor to the RPGA lost impetus with the founding of the Academy of Adventure Gaming Arts and Design, as well as the growing influence of a group called the Game Designers Guild, which also gave a design award at Origins. Arneson had trouble persuading other key designers that yet another award, one given to designers, never publishers, was needed. He organized a meeting at Pacific Origins, but Ken St. Andre would afterward complain that it lacked any real agenda or direction. For the rest of the year, Arneson's IFGS concept languished, but his ambition to challenge TSR was not curbed. For the July issue of Dragon, Arneson took out a full-page advertisement for Adventures in Fantasy, in which the logo of his adventure games company looms larger than life in the game's title. TSR staged a modest display at Pacific Origins, largely attending in order to influence the site selection for Origins in 1983. To their chagrin, the winning bid again came from Metro Detroit gamers who had stolen GenCon's thunder in 1978. With that, Origins would return to direct Midwestern competition with GenCons 2 years hence. This was surely in retaliation for the heavy-handed way that GenCon East brushed aside Avalon Hill's proposed Atlanticon, and the resulting bitterness led TSR to spurn Origins once again. But still, Avalon Hill had to admit GenCon East was more of an Origins than Pacific Origins in everything but the name. Contemporaneous reports suggested that about 4,600 gamers came to Cherry Hill, New Jersey in the last weekend of July to attend. Although Gary Gygax was advertised as a guest of honor at a special dinner at GenCon East, he reportedly took ill at the last minute, and attendees never laid eyes on him there. But Gygax would never miss the main GenCon, where attendance at Parkside came in at 5,100. a healthy lead on Origins. The main D&D release for the convention would be the long-awaited Fiend Folio. Due to various legal issues surrounding the disassociation of Games Workshop with TSR early in 1980, the Fiend Folio had as its editor Don Turnbull would explain, languished in a sort of legal limbo, untouched and untouchable, for nearly 2 years after completion. It exited that plane in February 1981, but the volume would not make it into the hands of gamers until that summer. Marking the fifth consecutive year that TSR had published a hardcover Advanced Dungeons & Dragons book. Gygax himself delivered a GenCon seminar, one that was scheduled the last minute via the Daily News. Updates circulated on site, and given a 2-hour slot just after lunch on Thursday, the topic was the D&D game system versus the AD&D game system. Gygax still hoped to litigate in the court of public opinion the legal matter that had been settled early in the year, but GenCon was more focused on the future of the game than its history. The inside cover of the program advertised the location of Mattel's booth in the exhibit hall, and Mattel took out a full-page advertisement in Dragon for the computer Labyrinth game in the July issue. "We've taken the Dungeons & Dragons game out of the Dark Ages," the ad copy playfully reads. At the time, electronic games posed no apparent threat to tabletop D&D, so it read as a light-hearted jest. This would be the summer, incidentally, that Donkey Kong would introduce the character of Mario to the world. A perilous time to neglect the surging popularity of electronic games. GenCon always had a way of re-energizing Gary Gygax. At GenCon 14, he related in the pages of Dragon soon after, "I had the opportunity to talk with many of you good folks again, and a message came out loud and clear. It is high time that I got busy and finished the Temple of Elemental Evil module and started producing regular information regarding the world of Greyhawk fantasy setting." Whatever decisions he had made about dedicating his energies toward business, game design was simply part of his identity. Gygax even invited TSR staff over to Dragonlands for a party on the second Saturday in September, a gesture demonstrating his return from self-imposed exile after the difficulties of the last 12 months. As Gygax returned to creative work at TSR, he became increasingly protective of his ideas. He circulated a memo in August forbidding anyone from designing material, including information on the politics, religions, or anything else associated with his world of Greyhawk. "This is my creation," Gygax insisted, "and any development involved will be done either by myself or by those who are familiar with my campaign and way of thinking." Greyhawk, like GenCon, was a property that Gygax retained a personal stake in, something he treasured above any copyrights or trademarks assigned to TSR that were now worked by its design staff. There were a lot of cooks in the D&D kitchen by this point, and it was getting crowded, to the point where TSR had trailer offices brought in and parked out behind the LRP building to house more employees. The only realistic solution would to be acquire a much larger building that could serve as a corporate headquarters with room to grow, which would include facilities suitable for manufacturing as well as office space. This would mean creating a significant number of local jobs, so TSR's wielded its leverage to secure financial support from local government. In June, TSR reached a preliminary agreement with the nearby town of Elkhorn to build a facility there, bankrolled with a $1.5 million industrial revenue bond from the city. But this provoked outrage in Lake Geneva and a scathing editorial in the Lake Geneva Regional News about the business hostile attitude of the city government before the end of July. TSR had a better offer closer to home, a $3 million bond from Lake Geneva. Gygax could already share with Steve Marsh in July that we have made arrangements to acquire a large building near to us, which we plan to move this year. It has over 30,000 square feet, and we should be able to devote all of it to offices and conference rooms. That would be 201 Sheridan Springs Road, just up the street from the LRP building, which in comparison spanned just a meager 17,500 square feet. As the new facility was the former home of a medical supply company called Torrent, employees would call it the Torrent Building, but it would acquire its own identity as TSR's headquarters once the extensive renovations permitted staff to start moving in. With the city's bond, Gygax explained to Marsh they would not only acquire this office but also build a manufacturing plant. The planned construction of a two-story manufacturing facility connected to the Torrent building, which would be itself granted a partial second floor, made the total projected footprint of the headquarters around 96,000 square feet. The regional news called it the largest industrial expansion program in Lake Geneva history. The town of Lake Geneva had placed a large bet on the future of its most unlikely success story. As with the previous purchase of the Hotel Claire and before that 723 William Street, TSR Hobbies itself would not buy the Torrent building. Instead, a real estate partnership comprising the company's directors would own the facility. Now that the directors included Kevin, the new partnership GB&B Investments was formed for this purpose. As before, TSR's assets would guarantee the debt, and TSR would pay GB&B rent on the building, which the partnership then used to pay off the principal and interest on the financing of the construction, bonds that would be held by the American National Bank of Chicago. Kevin Bloom in October could share with employees that they expected to close the deal for the Torrent building within weeks. As a tribute to the triumvirate now running TSR at the company founders' day party that month, the cake served at the Red Eye Inn now depicted three jolly faces: Gary, Brian, and Kevin. The real estate expansion was far from the company's most ambitious plan. TSR spent much of 1981 in negotiations with 20th Century Fox for a film deal, though delays resulting from the writers' strike declared in April made progress slow. Ultimately, they broke off talks because we did not believe that the studio would be willing to produce the sort of top-notch movie we must have, as Gygax wrote in September. In another contemporaneous interview, Gygax stressed that we didn't want to end up with the rather disastrous type of movie that Tolkien's Ring trilogy ended up with, referring to the recent animated features. Instead, a D&D movie would need to be based on the Dungeons & Dragons game, with imagination, creativity, excitement, and adventure, and not some sort of Hollywood epic which takes the name and then perverts everything else. Gygax hinted within TSR that 3 studios are very interested in a movie based on D&D gaming or AD&D gaming. We can be forgiven for wondering how that distinction might translate to the screen. He also disclosed to TSR staffers that we have an Oscar winning screenwriter lined up to handle the script. That would be James Goldman, famous for The Lion in Winter. But the mass media narrative was not entirely TSR's to dictate. The power of the steam tunnel myth truly became apparent in the advance notices preceding the September release of a novel, an inevitable novel, Rona Jaffe's Mazes and Monsters. The Los Angeles Times explained in mid August that the game to which both Jaffe and the book's title refer is one played by college students with such devotion that leads to a participant's mysterious disappearance. There was a real life situation in which a Michigan State student wound up missing after playing Dungeons and Dragons. Jaffe averred that the story is totally fictional, as is the game it represents, but that would not stop reviewers from linking it to a supposedly true story. A review in the St. Petersburg Times only remembered that neither Egbert's parents nor the private investigator who found him ever confirmed or denied that Egbert got carried away with Dungeons and Dragons and was playing the game during his disappearance. Though, of course, Egbert's parents had denied exactly that. If Deere still harbored the ambition to sell the story, Jaffe had handily beaten him to market and to the bestseller lists. Fiction could provide TSR with another opportunity for diversification. In September, its product review board vetted concept briefs developed by Rose Estes for a series of multi-adventure books intended to introduce younger readers to the themes of D&D. Jim Ward provided a thorough analysis of how these books would be superior to the popular Bantam Choose Your Own Adventure series, which included the four highest-selling juvenile books from 1979 to 1980. The planned Estes books, to be called the Endless Quest series, would be longer, with fewer endings, less violence, a more concrete setting, and a greater literary sophistication. By this point, product marketing needed to conduct research before an investment into a new area like this could be justified. Outreach to juvenile library groups, public schools, and so on would be needed. Ultimately, the project would be greenlit for the new year. Much of this professional approach to product development was driven by Kevin Bloom. In September 1981, at the height of TSR's boom, Melvin Bloom transferred his 200 shares of stock to Kevin. Previously, Kevin held only 5 shares. Now that Kevin was a director of the company, it made sense to give him incentives to increase shareholder value. But this might be a problematic transaction. Under the shareholder agreement, no stock owner had the right to sell or transfer shares without first offering them for sale to TSR and then for sale to other shareholders on a pro rata basis. Nevertheless, Kevin was issued a certificate, and he then became the third largest shareholder. A similar interest in motivating employees led to the expansion of the TSR profit sharing plan, which began acquiring treasury stock. By October, it was already the fourth largest shareholder, with 130 shares from a corporate governance perspective. Those shares could effectively be voted by the board of directors. This all served to further cement corporate governance under the Bloom family and Gygax. The company expected to hire some 60 employees over the next year, raising payroll to around $3 million, which required more executive messaging about the intended corporate culture. The October random events directed the attention of employees to the new TSR mission statement signed by all three directors, which boldly begins: TSR Hobbies Incorporated, its divisions, subsidiaries, will create, acquire, and manufacture, distribute, and license select adult, family, and children home-oriented leisure time products and services to selected customers worldwide and maximization of assets for the purpose of maximizing shareholder wealth and of promoting the growth of the company. It was replete with vacuous promises such as all management of the corporation will operate positively and innovatively. This was indeed the sort of company TSR was becoming. As a token of this new professionalism, Mike's Carr role was recast from general manager into executive vice president of the manufacturing division. He still reported to Kevin Bloom in that position, but his direct reports included Steve Witt as well as Sloan, Bob, and Jack, which sandwiched Carr uncomfortably between Kevin and various in laws. Carr had serious responsibilities in this role, including the construction of the new manufacturing facility on Sheridan Springs Road under the next 6 months. The building itself is 54,000 square feet overall, with 51,000 square feet devoted to warehouse, assembling, and storage areas, and the rest being office and work areas. Carr related to the November random events that the renovations to the Torrent building were being managed by Kevin and his brother-in-law Steve, so talk to Steve if you'd like to see the plans. Again, if anyone whispered about nepotism, Gary Gygax would not be one to point fingers. He elevated his son Ernie to head the Consumer Services Division, which comprised administration of the RPGA. Frank Mentzer now reported to Ernie. GenCon events and the Dungeon Hobby Shop by December, the RPGA could claim about 1,800 members, a bit fewer than TSR had hoped to attract in its first year. Gygax had written that we will be doing well if we get 2,000 initial members. To live up to the expectations for growth, TSR needed to cast a wider net, for example with television advertising. To further connect with the younger market, TSR updated the company mascot Morley the Wizard to look even more cartoonish and affable than before. In support of the new version of Dave McGarry's classic Dungeon board game, TSR would spend $800,000 on a media buy that covered 25 cities as the holidays approached. TSR now looked even harder at the traditional board game market. They had poached Mike Gray from Milton Bradley to help shepherd board game efforts. Having bested competitors, the likes of Avalon Hill, they now looked upward to bigger game. Reaching that lofty market would be easier if TSR improved the public image of D&D. A revised Deities and Demigods shipped. The year removed a few demonic elements, but there is some irony that a company trying to rid itself of troublesome optics about real-world religion would cut from its theology a pair of fictional pantheons, the Cthulhu and Melibonian mythos, rather than any of the ones corresponding to real-world religions. The chorus of Christian voices condemning D&D had become louder and more strident. Now instead of fringe preachers hollering into radios, we can find a more considered treatment like the article in the December issue of Eternity magazine, which reviewed the pervasive occultic overtones in the game and claimed that D&D perverts the biblical concept of resurrection. because for a Christian to dismiss the occult ties of D&D as mere fantasy is naive, the author concluded. To retain these materials in our homes is at best a poor example and at worst an abomination. TSR flourished nonetheless. In November, Incorporated magazine informed TSR Hobbies that its December issue, the company would be numbered among an elite group of 100 of the fastest growing enterprises in the United States. Incorporated rated companies on how much sales growth they had demonstrated in the past 5 years. Between 1976 and 1980, they counted TSR showing a 5,233% increase over that period, which ranked them sixth on the list. Management joyously circulated a copy of Incorporated's congratulatory letter, adorning it with another of the Peanuts comics that were a signature element of Kevin Bloom's memos. This one showed Sally Brown explaining a good grade. While Incorporated apparently based its model on TSR's 1981 revenue rather than its 1980 figures, it still shows the very impressive arc that elevated the valuation of the company, reviewing the $16 million in 1981 revenue at the shareholder meeting in November, roughly double the year before. The new book value of TSR doubled over the previous year to 2000. Had TSR waited until now to settle with Arneson, this would have doubled the payout to buy his shares. The Bloom family's stake in TSR of 990 shares was now worth nearly $2 million, but that was only part of the story. The 1976 option for 700 shares held by Brian Bloom and the identical one held by Gary Gygax each had a further worth of $1.4 million if either of them invested the $70,000 to exercise the shares. Even Will Nibling's option for 500 shares purchasable at $62,500 would be worth a cool million. Of those three executives, only Gygax, thanks to his royalty income, had the disposable income to exercise the shares, but who is in no hurry to do so. The option would not expire for 5 more years, and things could go only up from there. When interviewed by the Milwaukee Sentinel for its November 6th edition, Brian Bloom denied that D&D was a fad and predicted growth would continue. Milton Bradley is probably the largest producer of adult games in the world right now, Bloom explained. We probably have about 1/4 of the sales that Milton Bradley does, and at the rate we are growing, we are going to catch them in just a few years. Milton Bradley had just recently entered the market with its Dark Tower electronic game, which their own executives openly acknowledged as a simplification of D&D. Though it perhaps competed most directly with Mattel's Computer Labyrinth adaptation, but it is not clear which metric led Bloom to construe TSR sales as approximately a quarter of Milton Bradley's game business. Milton Bradley revenues came in over $380 million for the 1981 fiscal year. The company simply existed on a different scale. TSR had about 135 employees at the time, and Milton Bradley had over 4,000. A mainstay, Milton Bradley was estimated to hold about 25% of the board game market at the time, and its flagship product was still the Game of Life first marketed in the 1860s. The toy industry remained far larger than the niche hobby like TSR's. In 1981, the Rubik's Cube alone brought in some $50 million. The largest toy and game company, Mattel, broke through the billion-dollar barrier in 1981 with sales of $1.13 billion. A substantial chunk of that derived from 1 million sales of their Intellivision video game console, creating a vast potential audience for its forthcoming D&D cartridges. The licensing fees such a titan paid to TSR were, in light of its broader finances, table scraps. The gold-generating magic that Gygax and his partners had unearthed in the steam tunnels in 1979, when put in the broader perspective of the world of business, just conjured pocket change. TSR only looked like a big fish swimming in the tank with its peers in the adventure games industry. Released into the wilds of the broader hobby, it would pose little threat. Gygax estimated for the Milwaukee Sentinel that TSR's revenue would grow to somewhere from 25 to 30 million for the next fiscal year, the reporter being careful to note that professionalism had not made the company stolid, commented on the lack of a dress code, and that the company allows many employees to create their own work schedules. Mostly the reporter was captivated by the backstory of Gygax's heroic inventor character, how he quit his job as an insurance underwriter and formed his partnership with Kay. After many years of trying unsuccessfully to interest companies in producing the fantasy adventure games he designed, Brian Nye sat down in 1975 and said, "We're going to grow into a multi-million-dollar corporation," Gygax now recalled. Perhaps TSR also looked big because the tank it shared with the likes of SPI and Heritage had now sprung a leak. Many wargaming firms failed to adapt themselves to the changing market. It was a recession year for the American economy, and while adventure games were growing, most of the growth was in role-playing games. On December 30th, 1981, remembered by SPI staffers as Black Wednesday, SPI management announced a 25% staff reduction and a very uncertain staff path forward. And back in October, the Gotham column in Different Worlds had asked, "Is Heritage bankrupt?" before reporting a month later. Rumor from Texas has it that Duke Seafried may quit Heritage before January, depriving the company of its president. Following the lapse of its AD&D license, the Judges Guild was barely subsisting doing playing aids for Traveler and Tunnels and Trolls. It was not clear who would survive another year. The groundbreaking ceremony for the new TSR manufacturing facility took place on November 23rd. A ceremonial photograph of the occasion shows Gygax and the Bloom brothers on site, all bundled up for winter, shoveling the first parcels of earth from the lightly frosted ground. The mayor of Lake Geneva and various other dignitaries look on with approval, but inevitably the mischievous scamps at TSR repurpose the image for office humor. Their caption explains that this image actually shows the moment when the TSR board of directors shovel the last spades full of dirt onto the grave of the soon-to-be late game designer Dave Arneson. Even with the lawsuit settled, the great war that Arneson had long desired would now come to pass, with TSR squaring off against the remainder of the industry. In this struggle, however, TSR needed no adversary. It would prove to be its own worst enemy. TSR turn results for 1981. Revenue $9.7 million. For 3 quarters, $16 million annual. Profit, $1 million. Employees, 120. Stock valuation, 2,000. GameCon attendance versus Origins, 5,100 versus 3 to 4,000. Value of the Arneson settlement, over $1.2 million. Supposed number of witches in Sacramento, over 1,000. That concludes 1971. Uh, I'll most likely pick up 1970 or 1982 Extravagance tomorrow night.